I'll now introduce our first speaker. It's a great personal privilege to do so. In a pre-recorded talk by Professor Tim Lang, one of the original founders of Sustain 25 years ago, and always an inspiration both to myself and to the wider movement. Over the past 2 years, Tim has been working with the Ministry of Defence and the National Preparedness Commission to bring food policy squarely into the current political and global context. Like never before, our food and farming system needs to be made inherently resilient to the challenges that face us all: climate, weather events, supply chain disruption, and conflicts. And he posits the idea that we should see our food system and the food policy that supports it as a form of civil defence. We recorded an interview with Tim on Monday, and I'll start off playing back the recording by asking the first question that I asked him. You say, Tim, that we're entering a new era. How would you describe this?
Well, it's not me who says that so much as almost every analyst looking at any bit of politics, life, culture, etc. It's as though the post-Second World War reconstruction of the East-West and then the era of globalization of the last 35 years, 40 years, is now beginning to come to an end. There's something new. It's the age of autocracies, of very authoritarian governments, of the moment of US triumph when the Soviet Union collapsed, now becoming where the USA and Russia and China seem to be seeing themselves as a three-pointed global power elite, and climate change and society's inequalities and the dead end of economics at the moment. They don't quite know what to do about it. The extraordinary situation in food, where the post-Second World War reconstruction was all about trying to produce more food as the answer to hunger and poor health, and now more food has turned into the driver of ill health. This is a new situation. It's what policy analysts tend to refer to as the polycrisis, multiple things all happening at once, and somehow politics and policy in our bit of it not being able to cope, not seeing the enormity of it. And I think we've got that in food in a very big way. And in Britain, we're just not addressing it. The old business as usual differences don't seem to apply in the same way. Well, food resilience is easier to deal with than food defense, so I'll take that first. Resilience theory has been around for a long time. Essentially, the capacity of anything, a building, piece of metal, human society, to bounce back. That's what the word resilience means. It comes from the Latin resilio. But what resilience means differs. If you're an architect, you want the building to stay in the same place, wobble a bit, but bounce back if there's an earthquake. In food systems and in ecology, that's not so simple. Things change. Climate is changing, where plants that have lived for thousands of years happily are no longer quite fitting their ecological niche. Something is different. So resilience in ecology is requiring different things from us than previous eras. Food defense is a term from the 1930s, and I've unashamedly decided to try to bring it back, because essentially all human history has shown how food can be what we would now call weaponized, that food can be turned into a weapon on population, on the other side, putting cities under siege. Is something that humans have learned over thousands of years. Food can be used as a weapon. You can cut food off, cut water off, and you can starve a population into defeat. Food defense as a notion from the 1930s emerged because, particularly in countries like Britain, they were extended. They were getting their food, in Britain's case, from its empire. It decided in the 1840s not to produce its own food because it could get it cheaper. And suddenly World War I, World War II, that policy bounced back. And people arguing in the 30s for food defense said, we've got to actually be more capable of feeding ourselves and feeding our people well. Why? Because otherwise the population will be very unhappy indeed. And the most important thing to do when you're in conflict is to make sure there is some sense of unity, some sense of common purpose. Now, this is very old-fashioned politics. If I'd said this 10 years ago, you'd have said, well, why is he going on about that? Now, in the last 4 or 5 years, people see the relevance of it. Britain is, again, it's left Europe where it got its food and still gets most of its food that it doesn't grow. It's created a new system of food in the last 50, 60 years, and it hasn't thought about how to defend it. And my interest is not the military side of that, although it is interesting, but it's the civil, it's society. I'm interested in what in my recent National Preparedness Commission report called total civil defense, food civil defense, or civil food defense. I'm interested, how can the public be protected and how can the public protect itself? Now, I'm not saying that out of sort of militaristic tub thumping. I'm saying this is actually connecting us to some very old themes of the need to look after the population, look after population health. Unless you have people broadly on the same page, on the same carpet, differences between us, of course, but broadly accepting that it's people's right to be fed and it's in our common collective interest to ensure that we're okay, then you're missing a trick if you don't address that. So I think food defense is back in a big way. About 2.5 years ago, I was giving a series of talks around Whitehall and around the country, and had become aware a year earlier of a body called the National Preparedness Commission, and was sort of interested what was it doing, and it seemed to have some interesting people on it, sort of great and the good public policy type people. And to cut a long story short, they approached me and said, look, we're really aware that food is, the state of food preparedness is not what we would ideally see, but we really need to explore it. Would you do that for us? So I thought about it and discussed it more with them and said, yes, okay. I'd be very interested in that because I too think that is the case. We'd had COVID, we've left the European Union, all of those big shocks, etc. And you could just say, well, everything's okay. So I said too. And I thought I told the National Preparedness Commission I'd do it in a year. Well, it actually took me over 2 years to do, because as soon as I started interviewing people and saying, what do you think? And I went to very experienced people in the food industries, in civil society, in public life, specialists, experts, big companies, small. Over time, they produced a remarkably coherent position, which was in COVID, sure, no one had starved, but things had gone wrong. Fragilities were exposed. There hadn't been preparedness, and we really needed to get our act together better. And so the more I dug, the more I could see why the National Preparedness Commission had come to me. And the more serious my inquiry became. I looked at 10 other countries. I took on 2 research assistants. It became bigger. And I kept saying to the National Preparedness, this ought to be a royal commission, not just me, an old professor, fairly experienced, but nonetheless. But they said, well, come up with what you think. And I did. And it became a very big and very serious report, for which I do not apologize. It went into, on the one hand, sort of mass psychology, where I think we don't know enough and haven't thought enough about it. The mythologies that the British are terribly phlegmatic and keep calm and carry on. It's a load of nonsense. That keep calm and carry on was never used in World War II. It's considered too incoherent. That's not me saying that. The Imperial War Museum says that. So I uncovered a lot of things that we don't know enough about. Some things we do. We know the just-in-time system of logistics is itself a risk. I itemized, I think, 15 or 20 different risks that specialists think face us. I looked at the National System of Risk Register and the government resilience framework and the critical national infrastructure, all sort of stuff that comes out of defense and civil contingencies planning. And they didn't consider food hardly at all. I exaggerate, out of 89 national risks facing the country, only one was food related. And I sort of joked to myself, actually, I like to think these experts who did that went away and had a nice lunch and they didn't even think about food. And yet you go and talk to people in the food industry and in the food economy, in the food system or civil society, it's the biggest employer. It's the thing that people need in a shop immediately. And yet it wasn't being thought through. There isn't preparedness. I came into food 55 years ago after a PhD in farming and some direct experience of trying to think through why was Britain, this small island off the northwest of Europe, with its peculiar, in the sense of idiosyncratic, food culture? Well, it was partly because of the empire and colonies and decisions made a long time ago not to produce its food and to abandon farming. And then it was brought back in emergencies, in a little bit in World War One, and then back to business as usual after World War One, but then brought back with a bang, literally, in World War Two, after which there was a reconstruction. Whoever had won the 1945 election, they would have done what was done, which was to say, we've got to take food security more seriously. We've got to ensure feeding our people is a priority. And that had been forgotten. And we then entered a period where the assumption was that as long as you produce enough food, everything's okay. Now we know that's nonsense. There's an oversupply, an overproduction, malconsumption, malproduction, inappropriate foods, inappropriate pricing, the environmental damage of food, the public health damage. And this is a messy, complicated situation, all of which has emerged for very good reason, for understandable reasons. And I think we've got to address that enormity. And in that, we need different allies. It's not just black and white. Sometimes the big firm who sells huge amounts of food needs to be brought on board to put pressure on government to get its act together. That's strange allies. That's, if you like, in political terms, unholy alliances, not the normal divisions and alliances. And I think we may be in a time where that may be necessary. And that's really important for you people in Sustain. For me as an academic, that's probably less important, although I see that. I see it happening. I see strange alliances emerging because we're in a new era, new politics, a new fault lines, and new major divisions being not addressed. For example, right away when I began my study, very different people in the first sort of phase of my interviewing people said, when I said, what's the priority for resilience, food resilience? They said inequalities. People in industry or radical campaigners both said food poverty or food inequalities. You can't go into a time of conflict allowing great social divisions to occur in food. And that's where we are, actually. And that requires us to think very differently. Now, people, interestingly, I didn't set out to interview anyone from the military, but I ended up interviewing people by default I didn't know had long military involvement. And they said the same thing. When conflicts happen, behind that conflict, you've got to address those inequalities. And that is a very big lesson. So strange alliances may be appropriate. They've got to be thought through very carefully. You people in Sustain have got to think very carefully about on what terms do you operate. But on national interests, suddenly you find different politics, and people you didn't like before suddenly start talking the same as you. Is it you that's changed or them that's changed? This is all part of new era politics. Anyone who both knows their food history across the world or European food policy discussions, let alone Britain, this small island of ours, which is sort of cut loose again in some respects, but is now thrashing around. Which way does it face? Does it sort of pander westwards or see itself as European, or does it pretended it, has got more power than it's got. We're in a strange place, way beyond the world of food, but it affects food and food affects it. Yet there is a consistent theme that has come out over the last 20 years in Britain. Before Brexit, when the oil and commodity prices rocketed in 2007, oil went to $100 a barrel, and food prices echo oil prices. Suddenly, the West, the G8, Russia was in it then, experience told it we're in something different. And they said, we thought food was a problem for Africa or for the Far East or for poor countries. And this shock went through the rich world. And in Britain, that was taken very seriously. To his credit, Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister, got it. And he'd had early warnings from Sir Derek Wanless, the former chair of the National Westminster Bank, whom he'd asked in 2002, 2004 to review the future and the economics of the NHS. And the conclusion of Wanless reports was that if you don't sort out the food system, the NHS is going to be bankrupted. So Gordon Brown had become Prime Minister when this oil commodity crisis was going on, with food in his background thinking. And for 2.5 years, the then Labour government really got its act together and started thinking about strategic directions. And there was a process that you on this call may have experienced more with the Dimbleby process, the national sort of plan that Henry Dimbleby came up with. Well, that happened in 2007 to 10, but in came the coalition government, got rid of it all, in the same way that the Conservatives got rid of Henry Dimbleby's thinking. Well, we're now third time lucky, or maybe unlucky. We're in another big crisis, much more systemic than before, and we've either got to grasp this or not. So to answer the issue, what do we want from government? We need from national government what only it can do, a new framework. The good news is DEFRA has set up a new policy strategy advisory group. That needs to be pushed, to be lobbied, to be made sure that it doesn't just repeat history, but acts very quickly and doesn't say, oh, well, we'll do something in 10 years' time. Now the preparedness for shocks has to start. Now the preparedness to narrow inequalities has to happen. So government, only central government can do that. But in my report for the National Preparedness Commission, the Just In Case report, that's its title, I focus a lot on the subnational. Why? Because in crisis, as we saw in COVID, it's that local level that resilience really matters. What central government has done or not done gets worked out at the local level. Unless there's community solidarities, unless people get together, unless neighbors help each other, unless there is some sort of social underpinning at that local level, people get left alone. So we need what in the boring policy world I inhabit, we need multi-level strategy. Government central to do what it can do, cities and regions do what it can do, and communities and the local do what they do. We haven't got that joined up thinking at those different levels. And it's not helped, and I made that very clear in my report, it's not helped by the old British approach of divide and rule. The mayors across England are not given equal powers. The local authorities are all different and all struggling with lack of attention. The community level is almost eviscerated in terms of infrastructure. We've got to actually, and you in Sustain can be major players in that. I'm begging you to think about that. How can you argue for that coherence across the levels, from the local to the regional and upwards? And you go and look over the border from England into Wales, and you see exactly the same problems, but it's different because Wales has got a resilience preparedness system, the local resilience forums, as England has and Scotland has as well, which is slightly different because it's chaired by the First Minister. And Wales is beginning to think about this quicker. We've tended to think about Scotland and not enough about what we can learn from smaller entities. But my big thinking for you in Sustain, if there's one thing I'd like you to do, I think pressurize Angela Rayner and her new Council of the Regions. We need to get some food strategy coherence at the city city level, get those metro mayors who don't take food, although some of them are really interested in it, they don't take it as their #1 priority because legislation doesn't make it their priority, which is why I think we need a new piece of national legislation. And at the end of my Just In Case report, there's a very tight chapter with 8 major reorientations that I think are needed, and then very specific recommendations under each of those. But you'll see a theme about that multi-level governance, getting it together and not just focusing on one level, but targeting all of them. And it's ripe for being lobbied. I am a Northern and Midlands boy who's ended up more than half of his life now living and working heavily in London. And I came to run a think tank for London before Mrs. Thatcher and the government of that day abolished London's government. And I learned from that process a lot. And what is now Sustain started 39 years ago as a National Food Alliance of the National Council of Voluntary Organisations. And then another alliance more focused on farming started, called the Sustainable Agriculture, Food and Environment Alliance, the SAFE Alliance. And they merged, as you know, 25 or so years ago to create Sustain, a great model of people getting together, realizing that we've all got our little interests and our pet foci, but really we're only going to sort out something as complex as the food system in a good public interest way if we get together and learn our differences and face outwards and don't just talk to our own navels. So I think Sustain is really important. You are an alliance of different interests, and it goes from the professions to, public interest and social interest, environmental interest, all the great, and it's wonderful. Very unusual across Europe. People used to say in the Thatcher era, how have you got this in Britain? And the short answer was because Mrs. Thatcher said there is no such thing as society. There was no point talking to Parliament then because it wasn't interested. Happily, we live in more progressive times than that. Parliament normally is more engaged with food as an issue. But we have a huge mountain to climb now, and it needs you in Sustain to face wider, I think, than you are at the moment. And I'm not involved in Sustain at all, I should make that clear. But I think you are in a very important position of getting an alliance of the public interests. There are people inside the state who absolutely support what you do, and what you do has got to win other people who at the moment don't see food as an issue for them at all. My oddest thing I would say is, does anyone go and talk to the Ministry of Defence? Let me just tell you, the National Defence budget in 2023, this is in my Just In Case report, was £55.5 billion. The Treasury gave me the figures, of which I play a party game now. How much do you think of that goes on civil defence? Well, you haven't got time to put up your hands and throw ideas at me. It's precisely £65 million. So less than £1 per person in Britain is spent on civil defence. Now, if we're talking about protecting the public on food, do you think less than £1 a head is going to protect us? The answer is no. It cannot possibly be doing that. It's not even getting the organs and institutions of governments in the right place to enable you, me, us, our streets, our communities to do things that would improve our capacity for resilience. So I think we have some very interesting opportunities to talk with very different people. But actually, I think the #1 priority I'd like to throw you is not the Ministry of Defence, interesting though I think that is, but it actually is the mayors. Get the mayors to start saying we want to do more about food because they are about our population. They have the direct links. Now that applies to England, not to Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. So different foci for Sustain members for different levels.
I feel that if we were all together in person, we would be having a rousing round of applause for that. I did thank Tim when we pre-recorded him on Monday. What I feel like the finger of history is pointing at us to say, here we are in this particular context. And one of the things I'd like to say is now to welcome Kat Jenner and Dee Woods, who's going to be online in a moment as well, just to say we're here as representatives of the Sustain Alliance to respond to Tim. How do we respond to that very rousing provocation? One of the things that made me think about was COVID, actually. It was one of the few times when our country remembered that there are old people and disabled people who deserve support, that we remembered that children need to be fed not only in school, but during the school holidays. We had to take legal action to remind the government that they should pay for it. I just feel like this is a moment in history where we could really take stock. And Dee, I would love to come to you in a moment. I just want to introduce you, the wonderful Dee Woods, who's on our Council of Trustees, but is also an activist. I think you call yourself a food actionist, both at international level, going to the UN to talk about food sovereignty, while also coming back to community and doing batch cooking to make sure that the community is fed. You are an emblem of everything that's good in the food system. I wonder if I could come to you just to say, how do you respond to that? What we just heard from Tim.
I think, Tim has struck at the heart of some of the issues that our UK and global food system has. And as a nation, we're not food secure. We're not prepared whatsoever. We have a just-in-time food system. And I love that he recognized that communities are eviscerated because we've had so many groups of people, marginalized communities, subjected to slow violence for well over a decade through policies, through lack of access to good food, and with the multi-crises that are happening or have happened, including the pandemic. And unless we start doing things, doing that joined up thinking, doing that joined up practice, nothing is going to change.
I really applaud you for everything you're doing, Dee. And I've really felt as well that what you're saying is bringing the values back into this. Why do we work in the food system? Because at the moment, the food system isn't living out the values of public health, equalities. You said eviscerated communities. How do we put the viscera back in? The oomph, the resources, the ability to have the resilience and to feed ourselves, but also have the resource flows and the access to the land and access to the warehouses and all the kind of infrastructure of resilience. And in that, I mentioned public health. Can I now also introduce Kat Jenner, also elected member of our Council of Trustees from the Sustain Alliance membership. From a public health lens, how did you respond to what Tim just said?
Well, I think he's given us all a bit of oomph in that talk there. That was a very inspiring and galvanizing talk. And I think it's so valuable for us to hear from someone like Tim, because that institutional knowledge and experience is so valuable. We see the cycles coming over and over again, and we have to remember that and learn from the past. So learning from the failures, but also from the successes as well. There are really fantastic examples. And I know there's so many people on this call that have been able to show real action locally. And that's what we need to get together. I was busy scribbling notes. I think probably you and I, having worked with Tim for a long time, could write a book on the magic of Tim's. And I've seen there's a few questions in the Q&A coming in, which I hope we'll get to this afternoon. Some really interesting points. But yes, my interest is more on this damage, the idea of the damage of the malnourishment and malconsumption and misinformation that's happening, and that damage that's had on public health. And he talked a bit about resilience. And I think that's such an interesting concept in so many ways. And I don't want to gloss over this point. He said that resilience isn't just about doing business as usual. We need to be looking better. So now it's not just about feeding people, it's about feeding people well. Well, of course, we need to go further than that. It's not just about feeding people well, it's about making sure that we're keeping the planet well as well. So all those externalities have to be kept in focus as well. So, and I remember hearing this before somewhere, that one of the most dangerous phrases you can hear is, but this is how we've always done it.
Ah, yes. That killer phrase.
Killer phrase.
But yeah, because when again, looking back on a recent experience that showed us the vulnerabilities in the system, it seems to me that we often forget them again. So they've been going back to business as usual is the sort of natural fallback position, rather than saying we need to now do things differently. Like during that COVID period, I think we remembered for a little while about batch cooking. Like I mentioned, Dee sometimes attends our council meetings while batch cooking at the same time, you multi-talented woman. Cooking for others, remembering our food skills, baking bread, wanting to buy flour, loving our local shops, remembering that farmers feed us and deserve to be paid well, and for the supply chains to actually match their needs, and to be using all of the food, not having stupid cosmetic standards that mean that loads of it's thrown away. Just that, all of that remembering of the sensible use of food. And I come from an older family. My parents were older. They brought this up in me. I'm sure that's why I got into food policy, was because they would talked about the kind of food system that fed people during the war, which was inherently fair. Like doing rationing and stuff. I'm not saying saying we should all go back to rationing, but the idea that there would be a nutritional security net for everybody was vitally important during that time. To me, that also speaks of legislation. Tim just said, I scribbled it down while he was writing, that if we were looking to mayors and cities to do some of this work, they don't make food a priority at the moment, partly because the legislation doesn't make that a priority. I was with a senior leader in a big city government, I won't say which, yesterday, and said, why aren't you doing more on food? And he said, it isn't in our aegis. We've got to put it in their aegis. We need the legislation that puts it squarely in the aegis, so he has to know what's going on in terms of food supply. I mean, Dee, you sat on the London Food Board for many years. It's part of how we met. What do you think in that sort of city level as well as community?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, because cities and local authorities are ones who have that direct relationship with people. And we do need our local authorities to center food and center people. Because right now there's so many inequalities. You gave a figure for household food insecurity. And I found, we like to say, it's the tip of the iceberg, because the majority of people who are in that situation, they're not getting help. So how are we going to create those systems at grassroots levels, in communities where people are able to access healthy, culturally appropriate, nutritious, and affordable food, right?
Yeah, here, absolutely. Yeah. Coming back to CAP as well, because that also feeds into tackling the inequalities in health, which are horrendous in our country.
Absolutely. We've got, Tim was talking about the different ages. We are in the age of inequalities. And what we've done is we've managed to put all of our power in companies like the supermarkets and the big businesses. So we have all our trust and reliance on them. But actually, if you ask the public, they don't have a huge amount of trust and faith in these companies anymore. They see that they are perhaps exploiting workers or with greedflation in prices. And yet it's very difficult for us to get it back. And we're seeing these companies as well have such an influence on public policy making. And it was really interesting that Tim was talking about that sort of conflict of interest around who potential interesting allies might be. And of course, at this time, the people that have the ear of the government, I think someone said in the Q&A as well, is absolutely those big businesses. So do we need to find a way of working more effectively? And I think that's something that will be really interesting to see in the food strategy. I remember saying ages ago to Tim how sort of proud I was and how fortunate I was to be able to work for an organisation that didn't have funding from industry sources, let's say. And he said, Katharine, we all have dirt on our shoes. That's just about how much dirt you have on your shoes. Let's start thinking more broadly about our circle of influence.
What I will turn to, because we can also keep on describing the problems, is what gives us hope and what gives us the opportunity to do things better. And every single person in this online room has some part to play in that. So I keep on looking to all of the amazing things that are happening in our alliance, built more on, well, as I said, values of health, equality, diversity, embracing all of that. Farmer focused, it's a phrase we use in trading schemes. I'm on the board of a better food trading scheme that, trying to make it work for farmers, make it work for soil and the pollinators, as you say, it's all based on the environment too, right through to that being the supply of perishable fruit and veg, which otherwise doesn't get properly rewarded in the marketplace. How can we make sure that the right amount of money goes back to the farmers to do that properly? They're not doing very well on that at the moment, are they? Unfair practices throughout. And the trouble is, when we say that, it tends to sound a bit like it's all going to happen at the local level. Absolutely, loads of it will, but we need to be enabled to do that. And the enabling stuff is political, profoundly political, and that's the time we live in. It absolutely is. And like Tim says, it has to be driven and enabled by national action done by the people who can only do the release of policy and money to resource all of that work, to make planning policy work for us. Farm policy, soil, clean water, welfare policy, just been denuded yesterday, but we can fight back. Decent wages, procurement standards, all those things. I'm going to finish this session. I'm going to thank my beautiful friends, Dee and Kat, for your contribution responding to the marvellous Tim.